You think you know how a story like this goes? A lonely rancher, a mail-order bride, a piece of land a man would die for. But you have no idea, because this story isn't about saving a ranch. It's about the secrets that can burn a person's life to the ground, and the one woman who could walk through the fire without getting burned. Buford Lee knelt in the dust, the Montana sun already a hammer against the back of his neck. It was the third one that morning. The heifer's eyes were open, glassy, staring at a sky she could no longer see. There was no wound, no sign of a struggle, just stillness. A quiet, unnatural death that screamed louder than any gunshot. He pressed a weathered hand to her flank, still warm. Around her nostrils, a faint, sweet, almond-like smell clung to the air. It was a scent that didn't belong in a pasture. It was the scent of poison. "Damn it all to hell," he muttered, his voice a low growl. This wasn't sickness. Sickness was a slow burn, something you could fight with medicine and prayer. This was an execution. His foreman, Harvey Glenn, a man whose face was a roadmap of droughts and hard winters, rode up beside him. Harvey had been with Buford's father. He was more family than employee. "Same as the others, boss," Harvey said, not needing to get closer. "No tracks, no struggle, just gone." Buford stood, his knees cracking in protest. 15 years he'd poured his soul into the Triple Creek Ranch. 15 years of fighting off drought, debt, and the ghosts of his father's mistakes. Losing one cow was a setback. Losing a dozen in a week, that was a declaration of war. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this wasn't random. Someone was sending him a message. Someone wanted him broken. Someone wanted him gone. His mind flashed to the letter in his coat pocket, a letter written in a careful, steady hand that felt like a lifetime away from the poison in his fields. He'd almost thrown it away. Almost. That night, the ranch house was so quiet you could hear the floorboards settling. It was a house built for a family, but now it held only Buford, his 16-year-old daughter Ruby Jean, and the heavy silence of loss. Ruby was upstairs, pretending to study, but really just listening to her father's restless pacing. The world outside stood perfectly still, but inside Buford's chest, a storm was raging. He pulled the folded paper from his pocket and read the lines for the 10th time. He didn't need to. He already knew them by heart. "Mr. Lee, I will not pretend to be what I am not. I am a woman of 32, of plain means and a large frame. The world has judged me for both, and I have learned not to waste time on its opinions. I do not offer beauty or delicate conversation. I offer steadiness. I have taught school, tended the dying, and worked until my hands cracked. If you seek an ornament for your home, I am not she. If you seek a partner to stand with you against the storm, I ask for your consideration. Sincerely, Clara Whitmore." Her honesty was a punch to the gut. It was raw, unvarnished, and more real than anything he'd felt in years. He hadn't even wanted to place that newspaper advertisement. It was Ruby Jean's idea. One night, watching him stare out at the land he was slowly losing, she'd said it, half joking. "No use keeping all this land for just the cows and ghosts, Pa. Maybe you need a wife." He'd scoffed, but the idea had taken root. Not for love. Love was a luxury he couldn't afford, a fire that had burned him once before and left nothing but scars. No, he needed a partner, a fighter. Most responses were what you'd expect. Women spinning pretty words, looking for a soft landing. They wanted security, not a war. But Clara's letter was different. It was a blade, sharp, honest, and ready for a fight. He thought of Ida Bell Morrison. He'd seen her at the general store just yesterday. She'd floated in, all lace and perfume, on the arm of her banker husband, the same woman who, 5 years ago, had told him he was nothing but a man with dirt under his nails and no poetry in his soul. "Still running this dusty little spread, Buford?" she'd cooed, her smile as sweet and sharp as a shard of glass. "Some things never change, I suppose." He just tipped his hat, said nothing, but the burn was still there. She, more than anyone, knew how close he was to the edge, and he swore he saw a flicker of triumph in her eyes. He stood up from the porch, the decision made. He walked to the small desk where his father used to tally up debts and losses. He dipped his pen in ink, the scratching sound loud in the silent house. Miss Whitmore, your letter reached me during a hard week. It gave me pause in a way most things do not. I am not a man of grand promises, but I keep my word. The wolves are at my door and I have no time for ornaments. If you are still interested in a storm, I would welcome your arrival. Enclosed is passage to Sweetwater Station. The house is sturdy. The land is honest. I aim to be the same. Respectfully, Buford Lee. As he sealed the envelope, a strange mix of hope and dread wrestled in his chest. He was inviting a stranger into his home, into his war. He had no idea if he was hiring an ally or bringing in another enemy. But one thing was certain. The quiet, lonely fight for the Triple Creek Ranch was over, and the real battle was just about to begin. The train hissed into Sweetwater Station like a tired beast, spitting steam and dust. Clara Whitmore stepped onto the platform, and the world seemed to hold its breath. She was exactly as she described herself. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that wasn't pretty in the way of porcelain dolls, but was handsome in the way of a weathered mountain. Her eyes, a clear, steady gray, swept across the small crowd, missing nothing. She saw him immediately. He was the only one not looking away. Buford Lee, taller than she'd expected, with a gravity in his face that the letters couldn't capture. He stood like a man rooted to the earth, unmoving and unbreakable. Whispers erupted around them like brush fire. Is that her? My God, she's bigger than he is. What was Buford thinking? Clara kept her chin high. She'd faced a lifetime of whispers. They were just noise now. Buford strode forward, his steps deliberate, ignoring the gawking townsfolk. He stopped in front of her, his gaze direct. Miss Whitmore. Mr. Lee, she replied, her voice calm and even, though her heart hammered against her ribs. He reached for her travel case. Pay them no mind. I don't, she said, and it was the simple truth. Not anymore. The wagon ride to the ranch was a long stretch of comfortable silence. The landscape was beautiful and brutal, much like the man sitting beside her. Finally, as the ranch came into view, a sturdy house and a collection of barns nestled in a valley, Clara turned to him. I feel I should address the obvious, Mr. Lee. I am not the kind of bride most men picture. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hands steady on the reins. And I'm not the kind of man most women are forced to write to. We're even. That wasn't the answer she expected. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't a platitude. It was an acknowledgement. He glanced at her, just for a second. If you're worried I'll send you back on the next train, don't be. You told the truth in your letter. In my experience, truth is rarer and more valuable than charm. A strange, unfamiliar warmth bloomed in her chest. For the first time since stepping off that train, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Then you should call me Clara. He gave a slight nod. Buford. As they pulled up to the house, a girl burst onto the porch, 16, with Buford's dark hair and a fire in her eyes that was all her own. Ruby Jean. She sized Clara up with a look that was part curiosity, part suspicion. You're here, Ruby said. It wasn't a question. I am, Clara replied, stepping down from the wagon. Ruby's eyes flickered from Clara to her father. Harvey said we lost another one this morning. The brief moment of peace shattered. Buford's jaw tightened. That's right. Was it the same? Ruby asked, her voice dropping. The same, Buford confirmed. Clara looked between them, at the unspoken tension, the shared fear. The same as what? Buford turned to her, his eyes dark. We're being poisoned, Clara. My cattle are being murdered one by one, and I have a feeling you just walked into the middle of a war you didn't sign up for. Clara looked from Buford's grim face to the sprawling, beautiful land around her, a land that was already under siege. She thought about the life she'd left behind, the whispers, the judgments. She'd come here seeking a partnership, a place to stand her ground. She hadn't realized the ground was already soaked in blood. She gripped her travel case, her knuckles white. Good, she said, her voice ringing with a resolve that surprised even herself. I was hoping for a fight. Her first full day on the ranch started before dawn. The air was crisp and smelled of hay and damp earth. Buford, expecting her to need time to settle in, was surprised to find her in the kitchen, a fire already blazing in the hearth, coffee brewing. "Mornin'," he grunted, pouring himself a cup. "The coffee's fresh," she said, not looking up from the bacon she was frying. "The stove has a drafty flue. You're losing heat up the chimney." Buford stopped, mug halfway to his lips. He'd been meaning to fix that flue for 2 years. He'd never mentioned it to anyone. How did she know? "Just an observation," she said, as if reading his mind. She slid a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "Waste not, want not." Chakram, Ruby Jean came in, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and paused at the sight. She'd been cooking for her father for 5 years. She eyed Clara's plate, then Clara herself. "You don't have to cook for us," Ruby said, her tone defensive. "I'm aware," Clara said pleasantly, setting a plate down for the girl. "I was hungry. It's no more trouble to cook for 3 than it is for 1. An awkward silence settled over the table. This was new territory for all of them. A woman's touch in a house that had forgotten what that felt like. Just then, Harvey Glenn appeared at the screen door, his hat in his hands, his face grim. "Boss, you need to see this." The 3 of them followed Harvey to the barn. The air inside was thick with the metallic smell of blood. Lying in the clean hay of a stall was Buford's prize bull Apollo, a magnificent animal, the future of his entire herd. His throat had been cut. It was a clean, deep slice, not the work of a predator. This was done with a knife, a human hand. Ruby Jean gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Buford's face went white with fury. The poisoned cattle were one thing, a quiet, insidious attack. This was different. This was a violation, a direct, brutal message. "I can get inside. I can touch whatever I want. I can kill your future." "They came into my barn," Buford whispered, his voice shaking with a rage so deep it was terrifying. "Right under my nose." Harvey shook his head. "The lock on the back door was busted, clean off. Whoever did this was strong and quiet." Clara knelt beside the great animal, her face a mask of concentration. She ignored the blood, the gore. Her eyes scanned the stall, the hay, the floor. She wasn't a rancher's wife. She was a school teacher. So why was she looking at this like a crime scene? Her gaze stopped on something near the busted lock. She reached down and picked up a small object, tucking it into her palm without a word. No one seemed to notice. Their eyes were all on the dead bull, on the impossible violation. "Who would do this?" Ruby cried, tears streaming down her face. "Who hates us this much?" Buford's mind immediately went to one man. Victor Caldwell, the banker from Sweetwater. Caldwell held the note on his land, a debt his father had foolishly signed years ago, a debt that was coming due. Caldwell made no secret of wanting the Triple Creek, land he believed was wasted on a small-time rancher like Buford. "Caldwell," Buford spat, "he's trying to scare me off, trying to make it impossible to pay the note so he can foreclose." But something didn't feel right to Clara. This was too loud, too brazen for a banker. A banker would use lawyers and ledgers, not knives in the dark. This felt personal. This felt like hatred. Later that afternoon, while Buford and Harvey were bearing the bull, a task that felt like bearing a member of their own family, Clara found Ruby Jean by the creek, skipping stones across the water with a furious energy. "He's going to lose it all, isn't he?" Ruby said without looking up. "My father, he's going to lose this ranch." "He's a strong man," Clara said, standing a respectful distance away. "Strong isn't enough," Ruby scoffed. "Not against men like Victor Caldwell. Not when you're all alone." She finally turned to look at Clara, her eyes narrowed. "That's why I did it, you know." Clara felt a chill. "Did what?" "Wrote the ad," Ruby confessed, her voice dropping. "I wrote it and sent it to the paper. He thought it was my idea, a joke. But I did it. I knew he needed help. Not just a wife, but a soldier. I read all the replies, threw out the ones that sounded soft. Yours." Ruby paused, studying Clara's face. "The yours sounded like you knew how to fight." Clara was speechless. This 16-year-old girl, desperate to save her home, had chosen her, recruited her. "I hope I'm not wrong," Ruby said, turning back to the creek. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, casting long shadows across the valley, Clara sat on the porch, her hands busy mending one of Buford's work shirts. Buford came and sat in the other chair, the silence stretching between them. "You can still go back," he said quietly, not looking at her. "The morning train leaves at 8. I won't blame you. This isn't the life I promised." "You didn't promise me a life," Clara replied, her needle moving with steady rhythmic precision. "You promised me a storm. The storm is here. I'm not afraid of the rain." She paused in her sewing. She opened her hand. In her palm lay a small, ornate cufflink, silver with the letter M engraved in elegant script. "I found this by the barn door this morning," she said. "Does the name Caldwell start with an M?" Buford stared at the cufflink. His mind raced. Caldwell. Victor Caldwell. No, but he knew that cufflink. He'd seen it 100 times, flashing on the wrist of a man in a tailored suit. A man who always smelled of expensive cigars and smug satisfaction. It wasn't Victor Caldwell's. It belonged to Ida Bell Morrison's husband, the other banker, the one who had everything Buford had lost. But that made no sense. Why would Morrison, a man with no stake in this fight, be sneaking into his barn to slaughter his prize bull? Unless the fight wasn't about the ranch at all. Unless the target wasn't Buford's land, but Buford himself. And the person pulling the strings wasn't a rival banker. It was the woman who'd sworn he was unremarkable. The woman who looked at him with triumph in her eyes. Ida Bell. The storm, Clara realized, was far more complex and personal than a simple land dispute, and they had no idea how deep the poison went. Sunday morning came, clear and unforgiving. The bells of Sweetwater's only church called the faithful, and the judgmental, to worship. For Clara, it was a trial by fire. A small town's church was its courtroom, and she was about to be put on the stand. She wore her best dress, a simple cream-colored fabric with tiny blue flowers. It was practical and sturdy, like her. At her throat, she fastened her mother's silver brooch, her only piece of real jewelry. It felt like armor. Ruby Jean sat in the back of the buggy, her arms crossed, a silent storm of teenage anxiety. Buford drove, his hands easy on the reins, his face set like stone. He knew what was coming. He was choosing to walk into it anyway. For her. As they pulled up, the world seemed to stop. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Heads turned. The air crackled with a current of sharp-pointed curiosity. Buford stepped down and, in front of God and all of Sweetwater, offered Clara his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it was a public declaration. She is with me. Her fight is my fight. "Shall we?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Let's." The walk down the aisle was the longest of her life. The hush was deafening. She could feel the stares, hundreds of them, burning into her back. She kept her eyes fixed on the stained glass window at the front of the church, a depiction of Daniel in the lion's den. She knew the feeling. Reverend Parker's sermon was about forgiveness and judging not, lest ye be judged. The irony was so thick Clara could have choked on it. When the final Amen was sung, she stood quickly, ready to flee. But Buford placed a gentle hand on her arm. "We'll stay for a moment," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Let them see. Let them see we're not ashamed." His words were a shield. They took her breath away. The first to approach was a man named Rayford Clyde, tall and wiry, with a gold watch chain stretched tight across his vest. He owned the local lumber mill and carried himself with the smug assurance of a man who believes he owns the world. "Buford," he said, his smile all teeth. "Heard you finally took the plunge. Didn't expect your acquisition to be so substantial." The insult was slick and coated in false gentility. Clara's stomach clenched, but Buford didn't even blink. "Clara, this is Rayford," Buford said, his voice dangerously calm. "He owns half the lumber contracts in this county and twice the arrogance." Before Rayford could sputter a reply, a sharp voice cut through the air like a whip. "Rayford, you've said enough." An older woman with silver hair piled high and a posture as rigid as a fence post stepped forward. Mrs. Eleanor Clyde, Rayford's aunt and the undisputed matriarch of Sweetwater society. She fixed her nephew with a glare that could curdle milk. Then she turned her piercing blue eyes on Clara. "Don't mind my nephew, Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice crisp. "He was born with a tongue sharper than his sense. I'm Eleanor Clyde, and for what it's worth, I'd rather see a man with an honest partner than one of those simpering waifs my nephew usually courts." She looked Clara up and down, not with judgment, but with an appraiser's eye. "You walk down that aisle with your head held high, child. Don't you ever let these gossiping fools make you lower it?" With that, she gave a curt nod and swept away, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Clara's chest swelled with a feeling she couldn't name. In a room full of enemies, she'd found the most unlikely of allies. Just as the crowd began to disperse, Clara saw her. Ida Bell Morrison, standing near the back, half hidden by a pillar. She wasn't looking at Buford. She was staring at Clara. And the look on her face wasn't curiosity or judgment. It was pure, unadulterated hatred. A moment later, Ida's husband, a portly man with a nervous twitch, came to her side. As he adjusted his suit coat, Clara saw it, the flash of a silver cufflink on his wrist. With the initial M, Clara's blood ran cold. The evidence was right there, in plain sight, but it raised more questions than answers. Was Mr. Morrison a willing participant, or was he just a pawn, a puppet on his wife's strings, sent to do her dirty work? As they walked out of the church and into the bright sunlight, Buford turned to her. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said, though her mind was racing, "but I don't think our problem is just about the ranch anymore." Before Buford could ask what she meant, Harvey Glenn came running up, his face pale with panic. "Boss, it's the well! The main well!" They raced back to the ranch in the wagon, a cloud of dust billowing behind them. When they arrived, the scene was one of chaos. The ranch hands were gathered around the main well, the primary source of water for the house and the livestock. The water, usually clear and clean, was now a murky, oily brown, and floating on the surface was another dead animal. Not a cow this time, a sheep, a single sheep from the small flock the foreman Harvey kept for his own family. Buford stared in horror. The well was contaminated, poisoned. It was an escalation beyond anything he could have imagined. This wasn't just about his cattle anymore. This was an attack on his home, on his family. Clara walked to the edge of the well, her eyes scanning the ground, and then she saw it, a set of footprints in the soft mud near the well's edge. They were small, too small for a man. They were the footprints of a woman, and beside the prints, almost completely obscured by a rock, was a small, delicate object, a lace handkerchief embroidered with a familiar, elegant initial. For Ida. But something was wrong. It was too easy, too obvious. Like leaving the cufflink behind, this felt like a performance. Like someone wanted them to find these clues. Someone was setting the stage, pointing their fingers directly at the Morrisons. "It was Ida," Buford growled, his hands clenched into fists. "She's trying to drive us out. For good." Clara picked up the handkerchief, her mind working furiously. Maybe. But this felt less like the act of a scorned woman and more like the calculated move of a chess player, a player who was sacrificing their pawns to hide the real attack. As Buford stormed off toward the house to get his rifle, swearing he was going to ride into town and confront the Morrisons, Clara stayed by the well. She looked at the poisoned water, at the dead sheep, and she remembered something Harvey had said earlier. It was his sheep. Why would Ida Morrison, a woman who despised everything about ranch life, steal a single sheep from the foreman's personal flock and throw it down the main well? It was needlessly complicated, messy, unless the target wasn't the well at all, unless the target was Harvey. What if the dead sheep wasn't just a contaminant? What if it was a message, a warning sent directly to Buford's most trusted man? Suddenly, Harvey's behavior over the past few days replayed in her mind. His constant nervousness, his averted eyes, the way he was always the first to discover the latest disaster. Clara looked up at the foreman, who was standing apart from the other hands, his face a mask of shock and grief over his lost animal. But was it grief, or was it fear? Clara felt a sickening knot form in her stomach. They were looking for an enemy outside the gates. But what if the most dangerous enemy had been inside the walls the entire time? Buford was a man possessed. He stormed into the house, heading straight for the rifle mounted over the fireplace. "I'm ending this. Right now." "With what, Buford?" Clara's voice was sharp, cutting through his rage. She'd followed him inside, the lace handkerchief still clutched in her hand. "You'll ride into town, accuse a man of murder based on a cufflink, and a woman of sabotage based on a piece of cloth? The sheriff will laugh you out of his office. Or worse, he'll lock you up." "So we do nothing?" he roared, turning to face her. "We just sit here and wait for them to burn the house down around us?" "No," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense calm. "We don't wait. We think. They want you to be angry. They want you to be reckless. A reckless man makes mistakes." He stared at her, the fury in his eyes warring with the undeniable logic of her words. He was a man of action, of fists and fences. She was something else entirely. She saw the shape of the trap, not just the bait. "What do you see, Clara?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I see a performance," she said, holding up the handkerchief. "This is too perfect. The cufflink, it's a trail of breadcrumbs, leading us straight to the Morrisons. But who benefits if you're so focused on Ida and her husband that you're not looking anywhere else?" The question hung in the air, heavy and disturbing. "Harvey," Buford said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "No, not Harvey. He's been with my family for 30 years. He taught me how to ride." "Loyalty can be bought," Clara said gently, "or it can be broken. A man with a family is a man with weaknesses. What if someone threatened his wife, his children?" The idea was a physical blow to Buford. The thought of Harvey, his steadfast right hand betraying him, was more devastating than the loss of his entire herd. It was a betrayal of the heart. "How do we know?" he asked. "We watch him," Clara said. "We set our own trap." The next 2 days were a quiet, agonizing torture. Buford acted as if nothing was wrong, discussing plans to dig a new well, to buy new livestock. He and Clara put on a show of unity, of determined resilience. And all the while they watched Harvey. They watched him linger a little too long by the road after the other hands had gone home. They watched him jump every time a horse approached unexpectedly. He was a man walking on eggshells, his jovial nature replaced by a haunted, skittish fear. The break came on the third night. Buford and Clara had been taking turns watching the ranch from the darkened house. Just after midnight during Clara's watch, she saw it. A lone rider approaching not from the main road, but from the ridges to the east, using the darkness as a cloak. The rider didn't come to the house. He went to the small cabin where Harvey lived with his family. A few moments later, Harvey slipped out of the cabin and met the rider in the shadows behind his woodshed. Clara moved like a ghost, slipping out the back of the main house and circling around, using the cover of the barn and the fence line to get closer. The moon was a sliver, offering just enough light to see silhouettes, but not faces. She crept up to the edge of the woodshed, her heart pounding. "Not enough." The rider's voice was a harsh whisper. "He's still standing. He brought that woman in. She's making him stronger, not weaker." "I can't do any more." Harvey's voice was filled with anguish. "Killing the bull was one thing. Poisoning the well. People could have died. My own family could have died." "Your family will die if you don't do what you're told," the rider hissed. The voice was familiar, but distorted by the whisper. "Caldwell is losing his patience. The final payment on the note is due in a week. If Buford Lee is still on this land, our entire deal falls apart. And the first person Caldwell will come for is you." Clara's breath hitched. So Caldwell was involved. But he wasn't the mastermind. He was a partner. And this rider was the go-between. "What do you want from me?" Harvey pleaded. "Fire," the rider said, the word cold and final. "The grass in the south pasture is dry as tinder. A little wind, a little lamp oil. The whole valley will go up. It'll look like an accident. By the time the smoke clears, Buford will have nothing left. He'll have to sell. And you'll be a rich man, Harvey. A new start somewhere far away from here. A rich man or a dead one." The choice was clear. "Do it tomorrow night," the rider commanded. or we'll have this conversation with your wife instead." The rider turned his horse to leave, and for a split second, the moonlight caught his profile. It wasn't Mr. Morrison. It wasn't Victor Caldwell. It was Rayford Clyde, the arrogant lumberman from the church. Clara felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. The conspiracy was wider, deeper than she'd ever imagined. Caldwell, Clyde, and the Morrisons, a three-headed serpent, all coiled around the Triple Creek Ranch. They were all in on it together, each with their own piece of the prize. Caldwell wanted the land for foreclosure, Clyde wanted the lumber rights, and Ida just wanted to see Buford burn. As Rayford Clyde rode off into the darkness, Clara slipped back toward the house, her mind a whirlwind. She had to tell Buford. But as she rounded the corner of the barn, a hand shot out of the darkness and clamped over her mouth. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, lifting her off her feet. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled against a rough leather glove. She was dragged backward into the deeper shadows of the barn. The last thing she saw before the barn door closed, plunging her into absolute blackness, was Harvey Glenn, standing on his porch, his head in his hands. He had seen her. He had seen her get taken, and he did nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Clara for a moment. She was trapped. The air in the barn was thick with the smell of hay and manure and something else. Lamp oil. Her captor's grip was like iron. She struggled, kicking backward, but he was too strong. "Be still," a man's voice grunted in her ear. It wasn't Rayford Clyde. This voice was rougher, lower. She was dragged toward an empty stall and shoved inside. The wooden bar slammed down, the lock clicking into place. In the slivers of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls, she could just make out the shape of her captor. A large, hulking man she'd never seen before. One of Clyde's hired thugs. "Mr. Clyde sends his regards," the man growled. "He said you were getting too curious. He figured you might like a front row seat for tomorrow night's fireworks." He laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Don't worry. We'll make sure your rancher friend finds what's left of you. Eventually." He turned and left, the main barn door creaking shut behind him, followed by the heavy thud of an outer bar. She was locked in, a prisoner in her own home. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. Buford didn't know where she was. He thought she was on watch. By the time he realized she was missing, it could be hours. And tomorrow night, Harvey, under duress, would set the fire. A fire that would not only destroy the ranch, but also serve as her funeral pyre. She refused to let that happen. She took a deep breath, forcing the panic down. Her mind, her greatest weapon, began to work. She was not a damsel. She was a survivor. The life she'd run from had taught her things a simple schoolteacher shouldn't know. She ran her hands over the walls of the stall. Rough-hewn wood, solid. The lock was heavy iron. No way to break it. She looked down at herself, her simple dress, her sturdy shoes, and at her throat, her mother's silver brooch. She unfastened it. The pin was long and sharp, not strong enough to pick a lock, but it was something, a tool. She began to probe the lock, her fingers surprisingly nimble. It was a simple tumbler mechanism. She'd seen one like it before, on a locked cabinet in the headmaster's office of a school she'd worked at long ago, an office she'd needed to get into to retrieve a letter that could have destroyed her. This was a story for another time. Right now, survival was all that mattered. Her fingers worked patiently, methodically. The pin bent, but didn't break. She could feel the tumblers inside the lock, feel them shifting. Click. 1. Click. 2. It took what felt like an eternity, but then, click. The lock sprang open. She pushed the bar up, her heart soaring. She was out of the stall, but she was still locked inside the barn. The main doors were barred from the outside. She scanned the vast, dark space. There had to be another way out. Her eyes fell on the hayloft above. The loading door, high up on the wall, was used to hoist hay from wagons outside. It was usually just latched from the inside. She scrambled up the ladder to the loft. Her hands were raw, her dress torn, but she didn't care. She reached the loft, breathless, and ran to the large double doors. A simple wooden latch held them shut. She lifted it and pushed. Cool night air flooded her lungs. She looked down. It was a 20-foot drop to the hard-packed earth below. Too far to jump. Her eyes darted around the loft and found the hoisting rope, thick and strong, coiled near the door. She grabbed it, testing its weight. It would hold. She looped one end around a sturdy support beam, her hands remembering knots she hadn't tied in years. She threw the other end out the door. She took one last look at the barn that was meant to be her tomb, and then she began to rappel down the side, her feet finding purchase on the wooden slats. She landed silently on the ground, a shadow in the night. She didn't run to the house. That's what they'd expect. If Clyde's man was watching, he'd be watching the house. Instead, she circled around, sticking to the deepest shadows, making her way to the small cabin where Harvey lived. She needed to know whose side he was truly on. Was he a victim, or was he a traitor to the core? She crept up to the window. Inside, a single lamp was lit. Harvey was sitting at a small kitchen table. His wife stood before him, her hands on her hips, her face a mixture of anger and fear. "You have to tell him, Harvey," his wife was saying, her voice a fierce whisper. "You have to tell Mr. Lee everything. This has gone too far." "And what then?" Harvey shot back, his voice cracking. "Clyde will kill you. He'll kill our boy. You think he's bluffing?" "And what if that woman dies in the fire?" His wife sobbed. "What if Mr. Lee dies? Their blood will be on your hands. Is that the price of our safety? The lives of good people?" Harvey buried his face in his hands. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. "I'm trapped." Clara had her answer. Harvey wasn't a villain. He was a good man in an impossible situation, a pawn being sacrificed. She slipped away from the window, her plan solidifying in her mind. She couldn't fight Clyde and Caldwell and Ida head-on. They had money, power, and men. But she had the truth. And she knew just who needed to hear it. She didn't go back to the ranch. She turned and began the long, dangerous walk into town, under the cover of darkness. She wasn't going to the sheriff. The sheriff was a friend of Caldwell's. He couldn't be trusted. She was going to the one person in Sweetwater who had shown her an ounce of respect, the one person with enough power and backbone to stand up to the likes of Rayford Clyde. She was going to Mrs. Eleanor Clyde's house. She was about to turn a nephew against his own aunt, and she prayed the matriarch's sense of justice was stronger than her sense of family loyalty. If it wasn't, they were all doomed. Clara arrived at the Clyde mansion on the edge of town just as the first hints of dawn were breaking. It was a fortress of brick and manicured lawns, a world away from the dust and grit of the Triple Creek Ranch. She didn't go to the front door. She went around the back to the servants' entrance. A cook, already starting the day's bread, opened the door, her eyes widening at the sight of the disheveled, determined woman on her stoop. "I need to see Mrs. Clyde," Clara said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "It's a matter of life and death." Minutes later, she was standing on a fine Persian rug in Eleanor Clyde's private study. The old woman sat behind a massive oak desk, wearing a silk dressing gown, a cup of tea steaming at her elbow. She hadn't bothered with pleasantries. "You look like you've been through a war, child," Eleanor said, her gaze sharp and assessing. "And it's not yet 6 a.m. This had better be important." Clara didn't waste a single word. She told her everything. The poisoned cattle, the slaughtered bull, the contaminated well, the cufflink and the handkerchief, Harvey's coercion, and finally, the midnight meeting she'd overheard between Harvey and Eleanor's own nephew, Rayford. She told her about the plan to burn the ranch to the ground that very night. As she spoke, Eleanor's face remained impassive, a mask of aristocratic steel, but her eyes blazed. When Clara finished, the silence in the room was absolute. "My nephew," Eleanor said, her voice dangerously soft. "He would conspire with that grasping little banker Caldwell and that venomous Morrison woman to burn a man out of his home for lumber rights." The disgust in her voice was palpable. "They believe Buford will be forced to sell to Mr. Caldwell once the ranch is destroyed," Clara explained. "Then they will divide the spoils." Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town that her family had essentially built. "My late husband, he despised men like Caldwell, men who build their fortunes on the ruins of others. And Rayford, I've watched him become more concerned with profit than with honor. I had hoped I was wrong. She turned back to Clara, a new cold fire in her eyes. I am not wrong. You were very brave to come here, Miss Whitmore, and very wise. She walked to her desk and pulled a small tasseled cord. A moment later, a butler appeared. James, send a runner to the sheriff's office. Tell Sheriff Miller I wish to see him. Immediately, and not at his office. Here. The butler nodded and disappeared. The sheriff? Clara asked, a knot of worry in her stomach. Can he be trusted? He and Mr. Caldwell are friendly. Eleanor smiled, a thin, chilling smile. Sheriff Miller is a practical man, Miss Whitmore. He knows that Victor Caldwell pays for his lunches, but the Clyde family pays his salary and ensures his re-election. He will listen to me. She then turned to her desk and began to write, her pen flying across the paper. She wrote 2 notes, sealing each with a wax stamp bearing the Clyde family crest. She handed one to Clara. This is for Buford. It will explain my intervention. The other is for Harvey Glenn. Give it to him personally. Tell him his family will be brought here, to my home. They will be safe under my protection. No harm will come to them. In return, I expect his full and honest cooperation with the sheriff. She was dismantling the conspiracy, piece by piece, with nothing more than her name and her power. Now, Eleanor said, her voice all business. The fire is planned for tonight. We must assume Rayford and his hired men will proceed, not knowing their plan has been compromised. We will let them walk into their own trap. An hour later, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Clara rode back to the Triple Creek Ranch, not on foot, but on one of Mrs. Clyde's finest mares. She felt a surge of hope, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in days. She found Buford near the barn, his face etched with worry and a sleepless night. When he saw her, alive and unharmed, the relief that washed over his face was so profound it made her heart ache. He ran to her, helping her from the horse, his hands lingering on her arms as if to assure himself she was real. Clara, where were you? I was about to tear this county apart looking for you. I was fighting back, she said, handing him Eleanor Clyde's note. As he read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a grudging respect. Eleanor Clyde. She's on our side, Clara said, and she's bringing the law with her. Next she went to Harvey. She found him in his cabin, packing a small bag, his face pale with dread. She handed him the second note. He read it, then read it again, his eyes filling with tears. The promise of his family's safety was a gift he never thought he'd receive. She'll protect them? He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She gives her word, Clara said, and now she needs yours. You have to help us, Harvey. You have to help us catch them in the act. Harvey looked from the note to Clara's steady gaze, and then out toward the main house where Buford stood watching. The weight of his guilt and fear seemed to lift, replaced by a new fragile resolve. Tonight, Harvey said, his voice stronger now. He told me to meet him by the south pasture at moonrise, with the lamp oil. Good, Clara said. You'll go. You'll meet him, but you won't be alone. That evening, a quiet, tense anticipation settled over the ranch. As dusk fell, 2 wagons arrived, not by the main road, but through a back trail. They weren't filled with ranch hands. They were filled with Sheriff Miller and 6 grim-faced deputies, all handpicked by Eleanor Clyde. They hid themselves in the barn, in the brush along the creek, creating a silent, invisible perimeter around the south pasture. Buford and Clara waited in the darkened house, watching the fields. You took a hell of a risk, Clara, Buford said, his voice low in the darkness. Going to her. You took a risk sending for me, she replied. He looked at her then, not as a partner or an ally, but as something more. No, he said softly. That wasn't a risk. That was the smartest damn thing I've ever done. Outside, the moon began to rise, casting a silvery glow over the dry grass. It was time. From the trees at the edge of the pasture, 3 figures on horseback emerged. Rayford Clyde and his 2 hired thugs. They met Harvey, who was waiting, holding 2 large cans of lamp oil. Right on time, Glenn, Rayford said, his voice carrying on the still night air. Did you have any trouble? No, sir, Harvey said, his voice trembling slightly. Lee and that woman of his are asleep in the house. They suspect nothing. Good, Rayford sneered. Let's give them a proper housewarming. He took the cans from Harvey. He and his men began to splash the oil across a wide swath of grass, the scent of it acrid and sharp. They were creating a line of fire that, once lit, would be unstoppable. Rayford pulled a match from his pocket, a cruel smile on his face in the moonlight. He struck it on his saddle horn. The small flame flickered to life, bright and orange against the darkness. This is for progress, gentlemen, Rayford said, about to toss the match. Drop it, Clyde. The voice boomed from the darkness. Suddenly, the field was flooded with light as deputies emerged from their hiding spots, rifles raised, lanterns held high. Rayford and his men froze, caught in the glare like rats in a trap. Rayford's face was a mask of pure shock and disbelief. He dropped the match, his eyes darting around wildly, looking for an escape that wasn't there. One of the thugs tried to draw his pistol, but Sheriff Miller was faster. A single shot rang out, and the man's gun clattered to the ground as he clutched his wounded arm, howling in pain. It was over in seconds. Rayford Clyde and his men were surrounded, hands in the air. As the deputies cuffed him, Rayford's eyes found Harvey, who was standing beside the sheriff. The look of betrayal on his face was absolute. You sniveling coward, you set me up. No, Rayford, a new voice said. Buford and Clara walked out of the darkness, standing side by side. You set yourself up, Buford said, his voice cold as steel. You thought you could take what wasn't yours. You underestimated us. Rayford glared at them, his arrogance curdling into pure rage. But when his eyes landed on Clara, the hatred was visceral. This is all your fault. The mail order hag. You should have burned in that barn. Before Buford could lunge at him, Clara stepped forward, her expression calm, unmoved by his venom. You're wrong, Mr. Clyde, she said, her voice clear and steady. You think this is about land or money or even me. But you lost the moment you decided that a man's home and his life were things you could just burn away for profit. Sheriff Miller shoved Rayford toward one of the wagons. You'll have plenty of time to think about that in a federal prison. Arson, conspiracy, attempted murder. You'll be an old man by the time you see the sky again. As they were led away, Buford turned to Harvey. The foreman couldn't meet his eyes, his face wrought with shame. Harvey, Buford started. I'm sorry, boss, Harvey choked out. I was scared. For my family. I'll understand if you want me gone. Buford was silent for a long moment. Then he clapped a hand on Harvey's shoulder. You were a pawn in their game, Harvey, just like me. You made a mistake, but in the end, you stood on the right side. That's what matters. Your job is safe. The relief that washed over Harvey's face was a sight to behold. The immediate threat was gone. But Clara knew the fight wasn't over. Rayford Clyde was just one head of the serpent. There were still two more to cut off. The next morning, Sheriff Miller, accompanied by two deputies and a surprisingly resolute Harvey Glenn, rode into Sweetwater. They didn't go to the bank. They went to the Morrison house. Ida Bell answered the door herself, dressed in silk, looking as though she were expecting a guest for tea. Her smile froze on her face when she saw the sheriff's badge and the grim expression on his face. Ida Bell Morrison, the sheriff said, his voice leaving no room for argument. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson and attempted murder. Her husband, who had appeared behind her, sputtered. On what grounds? This is an outrage. On the sworn testimony of Rayford Clyde, the sheriff said flatly. Seems Mr. Clyde isn't very fond of taking the fall alone. He sang like a canary all night long. Told us everything. About your little plan to ruin Buford Lee. About your husband here sneaking in and killing his prize bull. The color drained from both their faces. Mr. Morrison looked like he was about to faint. Ida, however, drew herself up, her eyes flashing with a venomous fury. She didn't look at the sheriff. She looked past him, down the street, as if she could see all the way to the Triple Creek Ranch. That plain, oversized woman, she spat. She did this. No, ma'am, the sheriff said, as his deputies moved past her into the house. You did this to yourself. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place at the Sweetwater Bank and Trust. Sheriff Miller walked in, not as a customer, but as an agent of the law. Victor Caldwell tried to bluff, to bluster, to threaten lawsuits and ruin. But it was no use. With testimony from both Clyde and Harvey and financial records subpoenaed by Eleanor Clyde's lawyers that showed a clear conspiracy to devalue and seize the Triple Creek property, Caldwell's world came crashing down. The news spread through Sweetwater like a wildfire. The town's most powerful figures, the lumber baron, the two bankers, the society queen, all exposed as criminals, their empire of greed and arrogance built on a foundation of lies. For the first time in weeks, the air at the Triple Creek Ranch felt clean. The weight of the constant threat was gone. The land felt like it could breathe again. That evening, Buford and Clara sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with everything they had survived together. "It's over," Buford said, almost in disbelief. "The fight is over," Clara corrected gently. "The work is just beginning." The ranch had been wounded. They were still in debt, still facing a hard winter, but they weren't broken. Buford turned to her, his expression serious. "Clara, I sent for a partner, a helper. I never intended for you to have to walk through fire." "You didn't ask me to," she said, meeting his gaze. "I chose to. I told you, I was tired of hiding." "Hiding from what?" he asked, the question he'd wanted to ask for weeks. Clara took a deep breath. It was time for the final truth, her own. "Before I came here, I wasn't just a school teacher. I was a governess for a wealthy family back east. The man of the house, he was not a good man. He was powerful like Clyde, and cruel. When I refused his advances, he tried to ruin me. He spread vicious lies, had me fired, made it impossible for me to find work. He thought I would break. He thought I would run and hide forever." She looked out at the vast open land. "But he was wrong. I didn't hide. I regrouped. I answered an ad from a man who said he needed a partner for a storm. I came here looking for a place to make my stand." She finally looked back at him, her gray eyes clear and strong. "I found it." Buford was silent, processing her story. He saw it all now. Her strength, her strategic mind, her refusal to be intimidated. It hadn't been born here in his fight. She had brought it with her. She had been forged in her own fire long before she ever set foot in Montana. He reached out and took her hand. Her hands were not soft or delicate. They were strong, capable, and calloused from work. They were the most beautiful hands he had ever seen. "My father left me this land," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But he also left me his debts and his ghosts. I thought I had to carry it all alone. I was wrong." He squeezed her hand. "You said in your letter you weren't an ornament. You were right. You're the foundation. The whole damn thing would have crumbled without you." In the months that followed, life bloomed again on the Triple Creek. With a loan co-signed by an approving Eleanor Clyde, Buford was able to pay off Caldwell's debt and buy new stock. Harvey Glenn, his loyalty absolute, worked with a renewed sense of purpose. Ruby Jean, who now looked at Clara with a fierce, protective admiration, seemed lighter, happier than she had in years. Clara planted wildflowers along the edges of the south pasture, where Rayford Clyde had planned to start his fire. Their colors, blue, yellow, and defiant red, were a vibrant testament to resilience. She patched the stove's flue, organized the ranch's messy ledgers, and taught Ruby Jean things no school teacher ever could. She brought order from chaos. She brought life from the ashes. The wedding was simple. It took place not in the judgmental church in town, but under the ancient cottonwood tree by the creek, the same place where Ruby had once confessed her fears to Clara. Clara didn't wear her cream-colored dress. She wore a new one, the color of a summer sky, sewn by Ruby Jean and Mrs. Clyde herself. Buford stood tall beside her, not as a lonely rancher seeking a helper, but as a man who had found his equal in every way. As the sun set on their wedding day, Buford leaned in and whispered, "Took us a while to get here, didn't it?" Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as they looked out at their land, their home. "The best things always do," she said. One late autumn afternoon, a dusty, travel-worn wagon pulled up to the ranch gates. A young couple, their faces etched with a familiar mixture of hope and weariness, climbed down. They were clutching a crumpled newspaper advertisement. Clara came out onto the porch to greet them, Buford standing just behind her, his presence a quiet, steady reassurance. "Ma'am," the young man said nervously, twisting his hat in his hands, "is this the Lee Ranch? We saw your ad. Looking for help to build a new barn before winter." Clara looked back at Buford, a shared smile passing between them. He nodded. She turned back to the young couple, her own smile wide and genuine, a beacon of welcome. "It is," she said, her voice ringing with the strength of a woman who had found her place in the world. "Welcome to the Triple Creek. Welcome to the place that knows how to begin again." Sometimes the greatest strength isn't found in fighting the storm, but in learning how to stand together in the rain and rebuild when the sun finally comes out. Have you ever had to find a strength you didn't know you had to protect something you loved? Let me know your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey to the Triple Creek Ranch, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of survival, justice, and the incredible power of the human spirit. Thanks for listening.